Welcome to the Viewpoint 6 Configuring Graphs Guide. The goal of this guide is to show you how to configure graphs and dating calculations in Viewpoint. For example, which graphs from which authors are displayed and which graphs are used to automatically calculate the age of the fetus. Graphs in Viewpoint refer to growth charts that are used in pregnancy exams to chart fetal growth. Dating is used to determine the age of the fetus, for example, the gestational age, or GA, as well as the estimated date of delivery, or EDD. Before I show you how to configure graphs, there are a few important points that you should be aware of. Viewpoint provides calculations and graphs based on published scientific literature. Any settings that are used in the graph configuration will be reflected for every user and every workstation. Viewpoint does not provide functionality to define user-specific graphs or add additional graphs. I will now guide you through how to configure general settings for graphs and then how to configure the default graphs to be used. To access the configuration, click the administration door in the entrance screen and select General Settings. In the General Settings entity, you will find the Obstetrics tab. In this tab, you have the option to change settings that affect the way the gestational age is calculated. First, Viewpoint allows you to change the default length of a pregnancy. To define the value at which a prematurely born fetus has a 50% chance of long-term survival outside its mother's womb, select the number of days from the threshold limit of fetal viability in days field. The rounding of calculated value field allows you to select either down or math as the rounding method. Selecting down means that the value is always rounded down to complete days, and selecting math means that depending on the value after the decimal place, the value will be rounded down or up to complete days. To access the configuration, select Graphs. Note that the ability to change the graphs configuration requires the user privilege Administrate Viewpoint. In the General tab within the Graphs entity, you will find the options to change graph settings. To add the reference of a graph so that it will be printed below the graph in the report, check the Print Reference of Graph checkbox. You will only see the reference of a graph in the report if the graph is selected for the report. You can also choose which confidence interval will be used from the confidence interval dropdown. Selecting the 5th, 95th percentile confidence interval means that Viewpoint will take graphs published with standard deviation intervals and convert them to percentiles. Viewpoint does conversion by using mathematically accepted standards for converting percentages with standard deviation values. If you select the As Published by the Author option, Viewpoint will display the graph intervals as published by the author. Finally, selecting the plus-minus 1.5 standard deviation option will convert all graphs using the plus-minus 1.5 standard deviation algorithm. If you select the Display and Print checkbox, Viewpoint will display the selected option in the form and print it in the report next to each measurement value. You can decide whether a range indicator or gestational age value will be displayed and printed next to each measurement by selecting the range indicator or gestational age radio button. Additionally, you can decide whether to display and print either percentiles or the standard deviation next to each measurement value by selecting the percentiles or standard deviation radio buttons. You can also display and print authors beside each measurement value by checking the Print Author checkbox. Now we will look at how you can configure the default graphs to be used in Viewpoint. There are two methods to select which graph will be used for each measurement. The first method we will look at is how to select graphs by author, and the second method is how to select graphs by measurement. To use the first method, click the Authors tab to display a list of available authors. Select an author on the left side to view what graphs Viewpoint offers for that author. To preview a graph as published, select the graph on the right side and click the Preview button. A check mark on the left side signifies that all graphs are used by that author. And a square signifies that at least one graph is being used. If you only want to select one graph from the selected author, select the graph and click the Select button. But keep in mind that selecting an author for a graph will replace the currently configured author. To select all graphs from the selected author, click the Select All button. If a graph is configured to be used, you can see in the field list area which fields a measurement is found in and what it is labeled as in the form. In the reference area, you can view the publication reference of the selected graph. Graphs cannot be deselected in the Authors tab. Rather, to deselect a graph, you must first go to the Advanced Options tab. Deselecting a graph will be explained in the second method. The Default Settings tab allows you to configure graphs to be included in the report by default, as well as which graphs to use for the age calculation by default, on a per form basis. You can also define the order of the graphs in the display area in the report. To configure these settings, select the Default Settings tab and click the drop-down to select the form to configure. To include a graph in the report by default, check the Print by Default checkbox. If a graph is configured to be displayed in the report, you can always remove the graphs from the report inside the exam. To configure any selected graph to be used for the gestational age calculation by default, check the Use for Gestational Age Calculation by Default checkbox. You can also configure the order in which the graphs are displayed in the Graphs tab and the report on a per form basis. To configure the order, click the drop-down to select the form to configure, then select the graph, and use the up and down arrow keys to change the order. You can reset the order for the selected form by clicking the Reset Order button. I will now guide you through how to use the second method of configuring graphs, which is selecting graphs by measurements. Select the Advanced Options tab, and in the Category column, you will find a list of all measurements where at least one graph is offered. To see which publication is selected, click any measurement and the reference will be displayed in the reference window. To select a publication for a measurement, select the measurement and scroll right to the Publication column. You will then need to click the drop-down and select the desired publication to be used. To deselect a measurement from using a publication, click the drop-down and select None. To individually configure which measurements should display and/or print range indicators, gestational ages, percentiles, and authors, check or uncheck the checkboxes in each of these columns for each measurement. These columns will be displayed depending on the settings in the General tab. Some authors offer gender and/or chorionicity-specific graphs, such as for the estimated fetal weight graph. This information will be listed in the gender-specific and chorionicity columns. To ensure that you will see all of the graph options for measurements, click the Expand All button. Some graphs are not normalized, which means that they do not follow a standard Gaussian curve. This means that Viewpoint cannot calculate percentiles from the graph by default. Non-normalized graphs will be indicated with a No in the normalized column. You can force the percentile calculation for non-normalized graphs by checking the Force Percentile Calculation checkbox. Forcing percentile calculations for a non-normalized graph is not absolutely mathematically correct, as indicated by the warning message, but can still be usable for dating. Some graphs are not published to be used for calculating the gestational age by using the ultrasound calculation method, as indicated with a no in the age graph column. This means that Viewpoint cannot calculate the gestational age from the graph by default. You can force the age calculation for age graphs that are not published to be used for calculating the gestational age by checking the Force Age Calculation checkbox, which will enable the Use for Gestational Age button for the graph in the Graphs tab. Forcing age calculations for a non-age graph is not absolutely mathematically correct, as indicated by the warning message, but can still be usable for dating. To show or hide the display and print checkbox columns, click the Full View and Partial View buttons. You might find hiding the columns useful so you can more easily see which publication you are selecting for which measurement when selecting authors from the publication dropdown. You can also expand or collapse submeasurements by clicking the Expand All and Collapse All buttons. If need be, you can always reset all of the graph settings to the default settings by clicking the Reset to Country Default button, which is based on the selected country settings configured in VP-admin. This concludes the Viewpoint 6 Configuring Graphs guide. If you need any help at any time while using Viewpoint 6, press the F1 key on your keyboard or click the Start Help button. Thank you for watching.